Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald back with a new episode of System Update exclusively on Rumble, and I wanted to discuss the tumultuous events today in Brazil, specifically the nationwide pro-Bolsonaro protests, along with the very strong reaction on the part of various parts of the political and media class to some pretty extreme statements that he said as part of the protest today. Now, today in Brazil, you should know, is September 7th, which is the country's Independence Day. It's the equivalent of July 4th for the United States, the day when Brazil in 1822 declared independence from Portugal, the country that had colonized it. And for weeks heading into September 7th, a big national holiday in Brazil, the Bolsonaro government, the Bolsonaro movement had been making clear they intended very large, wide-scale protests in support of the president. Is most of you know, there is an election approaching in 2022 in which most polls show Bolsonaro very far behind his principal challenger, former two-term president Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party. And this was intended as a show of force, along with other things as well, that were designed to send a message to the country on Bolsonaro's behalf. Now, there's a couple of very reductive and simplistic narratives that have been disseminated both beforehand and today about these protests. On the one hand, critics of Bolsonaro insist that this is just the first step by a maniacal dictator toward instituting a coup and undermining and then destroying Brazilian democracy in anticipation of next year's election that he knows he can't win. The counter narrative is that this is nothing more than an attempt by Bolsonaro and his movement to take a stand against the Supreme Court in particular, which has become tyrannical in its attacks on the free speech and other political rights of Bolsonaro and his followers. And if you're looking for somebody to spend the next 10 minutes championing or just pushing uncritically either of those two narratives, this video will not be for you. This is not what I'm intending to do. Here is to embrace one of those two pro or con narratives and just in a polemical sort of way advocate for them. What I really want to do, given how superficial and I think misleading a lot of the media coverage has been of what's happening in Brazil generally and what happened in the events today specifically, is provide what I think is the crucial context for understanding what really took place. Now, leading up to today, when the Bolsonaro government announced that it was intending to have nationwide protests, the Brazilian media and the international media depicted what was likely to happen today in the most kind of histrionic and extreme terms. So if we just take a look at a couple of examples, here's The Guardian from September 5th. The headlines: fears of violence on Brazil's streets as millions rally to back Bolsonaro. Fears of violence on Brazil's streets. I can tell you that did not really happen today. Maybe there have been isolated cases of fights, but by and large, this kind of widespread violence a lot of media people were predicting did not materialize. The protests were largely peaceful. Here's an even more extreme version from my former outlet, The Intercept, on the same date, September 5th, which called it Jair Bolsonaro's pro-coup rally. September 7th is shaping up to be Brazil's January 6th. Obviously, The Intercept has zero capability, like most liberal media outlets, to understand the world except by reference to Donald Trump. So they claimed today was going to be his version, Bolsonaro's version of January 6th, as they just got done saying there were no invasions of federal buildings. No one was killed, to my knowledge, at least as of taping, late at night. And to the extent there was violence, it was very isolated, nothing organized, nothing even close to the kind of insurrection or pro-coup movement that news outlets like The Intercept were predicting / hoping for, same with The Guardian and most others. Now, what did happen today? There were protests all over the country. They were, I would say, moderate in size. There were some places where they were quite large, nothing out of the ordinary or exceptional. Brazil is a country of 220 million people. It's a big country. It's the 5th most populous country in the world. Polls show that Bolsonaro still has 25% of the populace, more or less, in support of him. So obviously you can put a couple million people on the streets around the country. Same thing with anti-Bolsonaro protests. I'm not sure how much that tells us. The much more significant events was that Bolsonaro made a speech first in Brasilia, the capital where he lives. He then flew to Sao Paulo, the largest city in Brazil, the largest city, in fact, in the Western Hemisphere, and made another speech, and that's what really caused the huge repercussions. So let's just look at a video of here in Brasilia. This was the first protest that happened this morning. It was taken by the Twitter user whose name is on the screen. It just gives you a sense of the size of the protest as Bolsonaro addressed the crowd.
Mais do que isso, nós devemos, sim, porque eu falo em nome de vocês, determinar que todos os presos políticos sejam postos em liberdade.
I'm not sure that that was actually Brasilia. I think it might have been Sao Paulo. It's difficult for me to tell from the monitor, but you could see the size of the protest. It's certainly not a small protest by any means. It was sizable. It was probably something that met the expectations of people, but I wouldn't say wildly exceeded them. As you can see, it was a fairly peaceful crowd. That was the case for most of the day. Now, what really ended up being the most newsworthy aspects of today was what Bolsonaro said first in Brasilia and then in Sao Paulo. In Brasilia, he gave a speech in which he pretty implicitly and came very close to explicitly threatening the Supreme Court. He referenced one judge in particular on the Supreme Court, who I'm going to discuss in a minute, but didn't name him, and essentially said to the president of the Supreme Court, if you don't get him under control, if you don't start to limit and put him in his place, what's going to happen to the court is something none of us want, implicitly insinuating that the court could be shut or he could do an attack on the court. He's been increasingly insisting that the Supreme Court has been acting in an unconstitutional manner towards him, his government, his family, and his supporters, and suggesting that if the Supreme Court continues on this unconstitutional path as he sees it, he's vowing retaliation to unconstitutionally attack the Supreme Court. There are supporters of his who want to close the Supreme Court. Jair Bolsonaro himself, over the last 30 years when he was in Congress, has vowed to close the Congress, close the Supreme Court. The military dictatorship that ruled the country from 1964 to 1985 notoriously did that. They issued various decrees that allowed them to shut the court, remove members of Congress who were in dissent. And so this kind of language about threatening the court, closing the court, is always disturbing to a lot of different people. That was what Bolsonaro said in Brasilia, and there were a lot of people, including people who had kind of been on the fence before about his impeachment, who said that this was the language of a coup. Threatening to close the Supreme Court or attack the Supreme Court is the language of a coup, and many of them, like his potential adversary next year, the governor of Sao Paulo, João Doria, a center-right figure who backed Bolsonaro in 2018, now said today because of that speech that he supports impeachment. I wouldn't read too much into that. He's Bolsonaro's political adversary, but that's the nature of the reaction. He then went to Sao Paulo, President Bolsonaro did, and addressed an even larger crowd, and there he singled out a Supreme Court Justice, Alexandre de Moraes, who has been leading a lot of the investigations and what the Bolsonaro movement regards as attacks on the Bolsonaro movement, and specifically said that two things. Number one is from now on, he will no longer abide by or obey the rulings of that Supreme Court justice. That's the president announcing that he will no longer recognize the validity of or obey or abide by the rulings of that Supreme Court justice. And he also said, and this is now the second time he said it in the last couple of weeks, there's only three outcomes for me. Number one, I go to prison. Number two, I die. Or number three, I win. And he made clear every time he says it, I'm not going to prison, which means the only two options left are I win or I die. And again, he said today, the only way they're going to take me out of Brasilia, out of the presidency, is if I'm dead. So it's a very melodramatic, a very stark statement. And obviously, people reacted with a lot of alarm to that kind of statement. Now, again, I think it's very easy to fall for one of those two narratives. You can say, oh, look, that's the language of a coup. He's threatening a coup, except there was no coup. There wasn't any invasions of government buildings. There wasn't anything like January 6th, or let alone worse, as a lot of people feared. So it's very hard to just say, oh, what he's after is a coup, and this is the first step, given that other than those speeches, which I don't want to minimize, but other than those, there weren't a lot of the manifestations of violence and instability that a lot of people feared or predicted. On the other hand, it's easy to say, oh, well, what happened was the Supreme Court has been tyrannical, has exceeded its limits, has imprisoned a lot of followers of Bolsonaro, which is true. And that's such a grave and invalid and illegal attack that the president is doing nothing more than standing up for the Constitution. What I want to do is avoid those two reductive narratives. And there's some truth to both of those. And I've talked about it before and I will again. But what I want to do instead is just give you the context so that when you hear about what's going on in Brazil, you understand what actually is taking place and therefore are much less vulnerable to being deceived or manipulated by propaganda on one side or the other. And I want to point out two components of the Bolsonaro government and what's taking place in Brazil. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more complex, but I just want to focus quickly on two that I think are the key to understanding what really is taking place. The key fact of the Bolsonaro presidency, basically since the beginning, is that he and his family are embroiled in very serious corruption scandals. I don't mean the kind of scandals that plagued Donald Trump about whether he was colluding with Russia or interfering in Ukraine, or even the kind of vague transactions that some of his children had, or putting people in Trump hotels. I'm talking about the fact that Jair Bolsonaro has spent his entire adult life in public service, working for the government. He comes from a humble family, no family wealth. He was in the military. He was a captain, an army captain during the military dictatorship. He rather dramatically separated from the military by complaining about low pay and the way soldiers were treated, became a hero, and from there he ran for Rio de Janeiro City Council in the mid-'80s and won, and then immediately thereafter ran for the Congress in Rio de Janeiro and won, and spent the last 30 years before being elected president, the last 28 years, as a member of Congress. So he comes from humble beginnings. He was in the army, ran for city council and won, was a congressman for 30 years, and then got elected president. Was never in the private sector. He has three sons that followed exactly the same path, used the family name to catapult themselves into political office. His eldest son, Flavio, was a state representative for 10 years from Rio State, and in 2018 got elected to the federal Senate. His second son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, is a congressman from Sao Paulo who got the largest vote total in 2018 of any candidate running for Congress. And then his youngest son, Carlos Bolsonaro, is on the Rio de Janeiro City Council, who has served on that body since he's 18. So all of the Bolsonaros have been on the public payroll basically for their whole entire lives. And yet somehow they're all extremely rich. Extremely rich. They own millions and millions of dollars in real estate that no one can explain the origins of. They buy real estate in cash, just in cash, and no one knows where that money comes from. They have businesses, there's millions of dollars flying around. And so I say this as somebody who's being as objective as I possibly can. I do have my own history with Bolsonaro. He has threatened me before with prison. The government tried to imprison me. My husband is a member of Congress from the oppositional party. So all cards on the table. But nonetheless, I'm saying this just objectively. The evidence is overwhelming that he and his children, at least two of them, are guilty of serious corruption, personal enrichment on the public dime. The primary corruption scheme is that they all have 15 to 20 employees that they get to hire as being members of Congress or members of the city council. They hire phantom employees, people who don't show up, and the deal is you get 10% of the salary and kick back 90% of the salary to me. They've been doing it for years. When you have enough employees, that turns into a lot of money. You're basically making the salary of 20 different people. That enables you to do other kinds of transactions. I say this just objectively. The evidence is overwhelming that they are corrupt and guilty of serious corruption schemes. There are other even more serious ones, but those are the ones I just want to confine myself to. There are ongoing police investigations into these corruption scandals, and Bolsonaro's presidency has been dominated from the start by one goal. to keep first his oldest son, Flavio, out of prison, then to keep his other son, Carlos Bolsonaro, out of prison, then to keep himself and his wife out of prison. And that's why he keeps saying, there are only three options for me. If I leave the presidency, prison, death, or I win. He's clearly thinking about the possibility that he could go to prison. Now, these corruption schemes, have I said, plagued him from the very start. I've written about them and covered them extensively here from April of 2020, so just 3 months after Bolsonaro's inauguration. I produced a video and wrote an article in which I called it the grave three-pronged crisis, crippling Brazil and imperiling the Bolsonaro presidency. Here's from the BBC in June of 2020, the headline, Brazil corruption, police arrest ex-aide to Jair Bolsonaro's son, Flavio. Here is the March 2021 report from Globo about the purchase by his son Flavio, who again has spent his whole adult life on the public payroll, of a mansion in Brasilia, in the richest neighborhood in Brasilia, for 6 million reais, which is about $1.5 million. And you can see here, that's a picture of Flavio Bolsonaro's mansion in Brasilia. He also has a house in Rio where he's from. You can see what that's like. Where did all this money come from to buy a mansion this extravagant from a family that has no apparent origins of wealth in the private sector and has done nothing but been on the public payroll for all these years? So what I believe is going on more than anything, and from the start we've seen this, is that Bolsonaro won on an anti-corruption platform. And from the start, his presidency has been plagued by corruption scandals that embroil his three sons, himself, his wife, and many of his close friends. I believe that what he's really doing with this protest is not a coup, but is saying, even though I read all the same polls that you read showing me way behind Lula and likely to lose, I want you to know I still have a lot of strength. I have a quarter of the country fanatically supportive of me. Many of them are armed. Many come from the military police or the police. They're willing to go out on the streets for me. I can create a lot of chaos and a lot of instability. And if you think you're going to defeat me next year and then just put my children and me into prison without a lot of disruption, take a look at what I'm capable of doing. You can't understand Brazil, the Bolsonaro presidency, or the political conflicts without understanding these scandals, which are very real. They're very concrete. And if you know somebody who's a Bolsonaro supporter who knows what he's talking about, ask them. Just ask them. Where does this wealth come from that has enabled them to live this way? You know that I'm not somebody who endorses corruption scandals simply because of a political opponent, of someone who's my political opponent. The evidence is very, very clear. And much of Bolsonaro's presidency has been devoted to it. So I believe a big part of today was a show of strength, that he has a lot of political support still. Now, there's another side of the equation that you also have to understand that is crucial to the pro-Bolsonaro narrative that has gotten very little attention, unfortunately, in Western reports. As I indicated, the main target of Bolsonaro's wrath today in these speeches was the Supreme Court. And in particular, one particular justice of that Supreme Court, whose name is Alexandre de Moraes. Why is Bolsonaro so fixated on this one member of the Supreme Court? It's because this one member of the Supreme Court, obviously with the backing of at least a majority of members of the court, but most of it has done in his name, he has been overseeing an investigation that he claims are investigating two different potential crimes. One, people plotting to overthrow Brazilian democracy, anti-democratic plotters who want to overthrow democracy and restore it to the military era of dictatorial rule, which is a crime. Or number two, disseminating fake news in an organized and coordinated way. And as part of this investigation, this Supreme Court justice has ordered a dozen or more hardcore, loyal supporters, prominent supporters of Jair Bolsonaro, either imprisoned, their homes searched and seized, ordered them to be confined to home imprisonment, ordered their internet accounts to be closed on Twitter, Facebook, and Google, ordered them barred from using the internet or speaking out, and have rearrested them and re-imprisoned them if they violated those orders, all without charging them with a crime, bringing them to trial, showing the evidence in court, and then convicting them. And there are a lot of people who are supportive of Bolsonaro who believe that this is an unconstitutional attack on people who support the president and that it's political persecution. And there are a lot of critics of Bolsonaro, including myself, who have expressed serious concerns about whether this is starting to spill from a criminal investigation about what are crimes, plotting to overthrow the government violently is a crime in every country, and it should be, into punishing people for their free speech, advocating that Brazil was better back in the dictatorial era, just advocacy of it, or just in general supporting Bolsonaro, or more disturbingly, why people are being imprisoned indefinitely with no just trial, with no fair trial, with no transparency, with no due process. Now, as many of you might know, the reporting I did in 2019 and 2020 that Bolsonaro threatened to imprison me for, that the government ultimately tried to imprison me for, was about a very similar principle, but it was just in defense of another faction. The argument that I had made during that reporting was that there was cheating going on by the judge who became Bolsonaro's justice minister, Sergio Moro, and the prosecutors who prosecuted former President Lula da Silva in 2018 and removed him from the presidential race at a time when polls showed he was leading, and that was what led Bolsonaro to win. Now, my principle there was not pro-Lula. It wasn't pro-PT. My principle was that it's dangerous to allow the state to imprison people without a fair trial, which Lula never got because the judge and the prosecutors were unjustly collaborating with one another and cheating with one another. My argument was never Lula's innocent. It was that he never got a fair trial and therefore can't be punished. That was an argument that the Supreme Court ultimately accepted as a result of our reporting, nullified his convictions, which is why he's eligible to run in 2022. Now, it's that same principle that it's dangerous to allow an officer of the state, a Supreme Court justice or anybody else, to order people imprisoned without presenting proof of their guilt in a court of law, to preventatively imprison them indefinitely with no concrete guarantee of when their trial is going to happen or even if one will. Now, there's been foreign coverage of it, some, but not much. So here's Folha of São Paulo, which is a Brazilian newspaper, the largest one, but it's a English version of their article in which in February of 2021, this Supreme Court Justice, De Moraes, ordered the arrest of a sitting member of Congress, Daniel Silveira, after he attacked court justices. Now, this member of Congress, Daniel Silveira, is a member of the military police from Rio de Janeiro. He's a hardcore supporter of Bolsonaro. He and I have had some very ugly, threatening exchanges. He wanted me in prison during the reporting. I have nothing but contempt for Daniel Silveira. But he is a sitting member of Congress, an elected member of Congress, and it's quite extraordinary to watch the judge on the Supreme Court send him to prison where he sits until this very day. It's February of 2021 where he went. He was let out. He was determined to have violated the conditions of his release and ordered back in. The Congress did approve his imprisonment because he made a video that was interpreted as threatening the Supreme Court justices, but that's a member of Congress imprisoned indefinitely with no trial yet held, no proof yet presented. Everyone's seen the video, but that's not how due process works. There have been other conflicts between the Supreme Court and Bolsonaro, including here's August 2021 from Reuters. The Brazil Supreme Court, a judge, the same one, opens a probe into Bolsonaro himself over whether he received leaks about investigations into his son. Here's another report from the Washington Post in June of last year. The investigation into fake news targets Brazil's Bolsonaro, and critics fear a constitutional crisis. So there's no way to understand today's events. The focus on the Supreme Court, the anger at this one particular Supreme Court justice by not just Bolsonaro, but his entire movement, without understanding that over the last 2 years, more than a dozen Bolsonaro bloggers, writers, activists, and even members of Congress have gone to prison by the stroke of a pen by this one justice. Some of these cases, I believe, are absolutely justified. These people are psychopaths. Some of them have clearly been plotting to overthrow Brazilian democracy, but others are on the edge where it does seem like, at the very least, some of their free speech is being punished in ways that at least ought to be tested in a court, a full process. This judge is, in a sense, the victim. He's the one being attacked and criticized. He's then sitting as judge and jury and executioner by finding them guilty without a trial, sending them to prison, and determining when they can get out and if. So I think there are a lot of real issues raised by this investigation. I've spoken to and interviewed very harsh critics of Bolsonaro who are lawyers and jurists and experts in constitutional law in Brazil who find these proceedings very troubling. Now, again, you can't have a large group of people plotting a coup in a country. There's no country in the world that would tolerate that and wouldn't put people like that in prison. But you also can't have one Supreme Court justice imprisoning prominent members of a political movement, including elected members of Congress, writers, activists, without it causing a great deal of conflict. And that is a major part of the conflict that drove today's protests and drove Bolsonaro's most controversial and provocative statements aimed at the Supreme Court that he believes is acting unconstitutionally and this particular judge. Now, again, I have my own views of all of this. I do think Bolsonaro clearly is a threat to Brazilian democracy. He's explicitly said it over and over. At the same time, I think there's a danger that some of those headlines that we began with can be histrionic because just like Trump, Bolsonaro faces a great deal of resistance. He's actually been a fairly weak president like Trump, hasn't been able to get very much of his agenda passed through Congress. The courts have obviously stood up to him. The media has been adversarial, very adversarial. And so what we're seeing here in a lot of ways is a conflict between the branches of government that can be very dangerous because if one branch of government perceives that another is acting beyond the scope of the limits of their power, and especially if a leader with as much fanatical support as Bolsonaro still is perceived as being politically persecuted, or even if he believes that they want to put him in prison, which they very well might want to, you can see how that will be very explosive. Thankfully, today ended up not having the kind of violence and instability that a lot of people feared and predicted. But obviously, the conflict that has arisen between the Supreme Court on the one hand, Bolsonaro on the other, is nowhere near being resolved. It's probably at its most dangerous level yet because of today. The Supreme Court is met all day to see what they're going to do in response to Bolsonaro's comments. As I said, across the political and media world in Brazil, there's kind of shock and horror at what Bolsonaro said. That's being called criminal, that he advocated a coup. They're talking more and more about impeachment, which would obviously destabilize the political situation further. So I have a lot more to say on this. I'm extremely interested in Brazilian democracy. It's the place that I live. My children are Brazilian. I've done a lot of reporting here. I've lived here for a long time. It's a place that matters to me a lot. It's a place that should matter to you a lot. It's a very influential country, the 5th most populous in the world. It has a lot of oil reserves. It's geostrategically important. The 2nd largest country in the hemisphere with the Amazon in its custody. So what happens in Brazil really matters. And today's events were a lot more complex and nuanced than a lot of the media reports were suggesting. And so I wanted to impart as much context and nuance as I could to you so that you're equipped to process whatever you're reading and hearing in the future with at least the crucial foundational knowledge. Hope this was very helpful. Thanks.